Henryk opened his shop at 8 o'clock every morning, the same way he had done for 43 years. He would unlock the old wooden door, hang his coat on the hook behind it, and sit down at his workbench. Then he would wait. The shop was small and narrow, squeezed between a bread shop on one side and an empty building on the other. It smelled of oil and old wood, and the walls were lined with clocks of every kind, tall grandfather clocks, small mantel clocks, round wall clocks with painted faces. Every one of them was ticking. If you stood in the middle of the room and closed your eyes, it sounded like rain. The town itself was the kind of place that people passed through on their way to somewhere else. It had one main street, a market that opened twice a week, and a square with a fountain that no longer worked. Most of the young people had left, gone to the cities for university or work. The ones who stayed were older, and they knew each other the way people know each other when they have shared the same small streets for most of their lives. But customers rarely came anymore. People did not repair watches now. When a watch stopped working, they put it in a drawer or threw it away. When they wanted to know the time, they looked at their phones. Henryk understood this. He was not angry about it, but he still came to his shop every morning, still sat at his bench, still waited with his tools in front of him and his magnifying glass pushed up on his forehead. He was 71 years old. His hair was white and thin, and his face was deeply lined, but his hands were something else. His hands were the hands of a man who had spent a lifetime doing one thing very carefully. They moved slowly and with complete certainty, as if each finger already knew where it was going before it arrived. He had learned the trade from his own grandfather, in this same town, in this same shop. He was 12 years old when he first sat beside the old man and watched him work, and he had thought then that it looked impossible, that no human hands could do what those hands did. But his grandfather had placed a broken clock in front of him and told him to look, not to touch, just to look. And after 3 days of looking, Henryk had begun to understand. The parts had a logic. The logic had a language. And the language, once you learned it, stayed with you for the rest of your life. He had worked in the shop for nearly 6 decades. He had repaired watches that belonged to mayors and watches that belonged to farmers. He had held watches that were worth more than his house and watches that were worth almost nothing but meant everything to the person who had brought them in. The value of a watch, he had learned early, had very little to do with what it cost. On a Thursday afternoon in late June, the door opened and a woman came in. She was perhaps 50 years old, and she held something in both hands as if she were carrying water in her palms. She placed it gently on the counter. It was a pocket watch, round and heavy, with a silver case that had turned dark with age. She told Henryk that the watch had belonged to her father. Her father had been a soldier, and he had carried the watch through the entire war. He had died 3 years ago, and the watch had stopped the week after he died, and she had not been able to bring herself to come sooner. She did not need to know the time, she said. She just wanted it to work again. Henryk held the watch carefully and turned it over in his hands. He did not open it yet. He simply held it and looked at it, the way a doctor might look at a patient before asking a single question. Then he told her he would do his best, and he set it gently on a small cloth beside his tools. After the woman left, the shop was quiet again, except for the clocks. Henryk looked at the pocket watch for a long time. Then he began. His granddaughter, Nadia, arrived that same evening with a large bag and a pair of earphones around her neck. She was 17, tall, and she moved through the world quickly. Quickly through doors, quickly through conversations, quickly through meals. She lived with her mother in the city, 2 hours away by train, and she spent every summer with Henryk in the small town where he had lived his whole life. The city she came from was nothing like this place. It was loud and fast, full of people who were always moving somewhere, always looking at screens, always mid-conversation with someone who was not in the room. Nadia had grown up in that speed. It felt natural to her, the way a fish feels natural in water. Stillness, to her, was something that happened when you were waiting for the next thing to begin. She loved her grandfather, that was not in question, but she found his world difficult to enter. The shop, the silence, the slowness of everything, it felt to her like a place that time had left behind. That evening, over dinner, she asked him how his day had been. He told her about the woman and the soldier's watch. Nadia listened and nodded, but her eyes drifted once toward her phone before she caught herself and put it face down on the table. "How long will it take?" she asked. Henryk thought for a moment. "As long as it needs," he said. Nadia nodded again, but she was not sure she understood. The next morning, Henryk was already at his bench when Nadia came downstairs. She made herself a cup of tea and stood in the doorway of the shop, watching him. He had the pocket watch open in front of him, and he was looking at the movement, the tiny gears and springs inside through his magnifying glass. She had seen him work before, but she had never really watched. A watch movement, she was beginning to understand, was not a simple thing. It was a small city of parts. Wheels that turned other wheels, a mainspring that stored energy like a coiled breath, a balance wheel that swung back and forth hundreds of times each minute to divide that energy into equal, measured beats. Every part had a purpose, and every part depended on every other part. If one thing was wrong, nothing worked. If everything was right, it kept time for years or decades, or longer than the person who wore it would live. The movement of Henryk's hands was almost impossible to follow. He used tools that looked like the tools a surgeon might use, thin, precise, designed for work measured in millimeters. He would lift a piece so small that Nadia could barely see it, examine it, set it down, pick up a different tool, and return. He did not hurry. He did not sigh or shift in his chair. He simply worked as steadily as the clocks that surrounded him. Nadia stood in the doorway for 20 minutes before she realized how long she had been standing there. She went in and sat across from him. He looked up with a small smile, but did not stop working. She sat with him for the whole morning. She did not speak much, neither did he, but at one point he told her, without looking up from the watch, that the mainspring had been broken and that the damage was old, probably from a fall or a blow. He said it carefully and without drama, the way he said everything, but Nadia felt something shift inside her as she listened. Somebody had dropped this watch. A soldier, somewhere, in some terrible place, had dropped this watch, and it had broken. And now she was sitting here watching an old man on a quiet street try to put it back together. She did not say anything, but she did not leave. By the second week of summer, Nadia had started asking questions. At first, they were practical. What is that tool called? How does a mainspring work? Why does the balance wheel move like that? Henryk answered each question fully and without impatience. He had been asked these questions before, long ago, by apprentices who had come and gone, but no one had asked them in many years. She learned that the tools had names. Tweezers with tips finer than a needle, screwdrivers no wider than a matchstick, a small brush made from a single piece of soft hair for cleaning dust from the spaces between gears. She learned that the oil used inside a watch was not ordinary oil, but a special kind, applied in amounts so small that they were invisible except under magnification. Too much oil was as harmful as too little. Everything inside a watch required the exact amount, no more, no less. One afternoon, she asked if she could try. Henryk hesitated, not because he did not want to teach her, but because he was deciding how to begin. He found a small travel clock, not valuable, not meaningful to anyone, and he set it on the workbench in front of her. He gave her a tool and showed her how to hold it. Her first attempt lasted 4 minutes before she made a mistake. She pressed too hard on a tiny screw, and it skipped sideways across the workbench and fell to the floor. She swore quietly and bent down to look for it. Henryk told her to leave it. There were more. She should try again.
This was the lesson she would learn many times over the following weeks. Try again. More slowly, less force, let the tool do the work. Her hands were young and fast, and that was exactly the problem. Speed had always helped her before. She typed quickly, she walked quickly, she made decisions quickly, and in the city this was considered a virtue. But inside a watch, speed was an enemy. A movement made too quickly could break a spring that had survived 100 years. Patience was not just helpful here, it was the only method that worked. She was bad at patience. She knew this about herself. But she kept coming back to the bench.
The soldier's watch took Henryk 11 days to repair. The mainspring had needed to be replaced, and finding the correct part for a watch that old had taken several days of searching through small envelopes and labeled drawers. Henryk had a collection of parts that filled one entire wall of the back room. Springs and wheels and pins sorted by size and type, gathered over decades from watches that could not be saved. He knew where everything was. He moved through that room the way a librarian moves through shelves, with no hesitation and no wasted steps. On the morning he finished it, he wound it carefully and set it on the cloth, and they both listened. The ticking was quiet and even and steady, a sound that had not been heard, perhaps, since the man who owned it had died. Nadia sat very still. She had not known the soldier. She had not known his daughter. But she had watched this watch in pieces on her grandfather's bench for nearly 2 weeks, and now it was whole again, and it was ticking, and something about that felt important in a way she did not have the words for yet. The watch had held a man's time. It had been in his pocket in places she could not imagine, and now it was here, on a cloth, in a small shop, in a quiet town, ticking steadily as if nothing had ever happened to it. Henryk called the woman that afternoon. When the woman came to collect the watch, Nadia stayed in the back room and listened through the doorway. She heard the woman's voice go quiet. She heard her say something in a low tone that Nadia could not quite make out. Then she heard the door close. Henryk came back and sat at his bench without speaking. He picked up the next job, an old alarm clock that needed a new pin. He put on his magnifying glass and began. Nadia looked at him for a moment. "She was happy?" Nadia asked. Henryk did not look up. "She will be," he said.
The summer continued. Nadia spent her mornings at the bench and her afternoons reading or walking through the small town, which she had once found boring but was beginning to find peaceful. She noticed things she had not noticed before: the way the light came through the linden trees along the main street, the sound of the market on Wednesday mornings, the faces of people who had lived in the same place for a very long time and seemed, in some way she could not explain, to know exactly where they were. She learned to take apart a simple pocket watch. She learned to clean the movement, each tiny piece placed in order on a cloth so that she would know where each one went when it was time to reassemble. She learned the importance of that order. Put one piece back in the wrong place and the whole movement would fail. The sequence was not optional. It was the thing itself. She learned how to hold herself still. Her grandfather did not praise her often, but he corrected her carefully, and he showed her things without being asked: how to tell a good movement from a poor one, how age changed different metals differently, how a watchmaker's bench told the story of a life in the scratches and stains left by decades of work. He showed her his own bench and pointed out a mark near one corner, a long, thin scratch that his grandfather had made before him. He said he had always worked around it and had never thought about removing it. She began to understand that he had never been slow. He had always been precise. Those were different things, and confusing them had been her mistake. One evening near the end of August, he brought out a small wristwatch. It was plain and not expensive looking, a woman's watch with a cream-colored face and a thin leather strap that had dried and cracked with age. He set it in front of Nadia and told her it had come in last week, left by an older woman who had found it in a box of her mother's things. The woman had not asked for it urgently, she just wanted it to work again. Nadia looked at it. Then she looked at her grandfather. "Me?" she said. Henryk folded his hands on the workbench. "You," he said.
She began the next morning. She opened the case carefully, the way she had been shown, and she looked at the movement. It was simpler than some of the watches she had studied over the summer, but knowing that did not make her hands any steadier. She sat for a moment before she touched anything, just looking. She identified what she could see: the balance wheel, the gear train, the small jewels that held the pivots in place and reduced the friction. She looked for what was wrong, and after a few minutes she found it. A worn pivot pin, bent slightly out of position, catching against the gear beside it and stopping the whole movement each time it tried to run. Then she began. She worked for 2 days. The first day, she made 3 mistakes and had to stop and start twice. On the second day, she worked more slowly and with more care, and she made only 1 small error that she was able to correct. She cleaned the parts one by one and laid them on the cloth in the order she would need them. She replaced the worn pin. She oiled the pivots with a drop so small it was almost invisible. She reassembled the movement, piece by piece, checking after each stage that the gears moved freely, until the watch was whole again. She wound it. It ticked. It was a small sound, quiet and ordinary, but Nadia held the watch in both hands and felt something she had not expected, something that was close to pride, but heavier, more serious. She had not built anything, she had returned something. She had taken a thing that had stopped and made it move again, carefully and without rushing, and it had worked. She set the watch on the cloth. Henryk came over and looked at it. He picked it up, held it close, listened. Then he set it back down on the cloth and nodded once. That was all, but it was enough.
On her last day of summer, Nadia packed her bag and sat with her grandfather at the kitchen table before the train came. They drank tea and did not talk very much. Outside the window, the town was quiet in the way that small towns are quiet on ordinary mornings. Birds, a car passing, the faint sound of someone's radio somewhere down the street. Nadia looked at her grandfather's hands where they rested around his mug. She had looked at his hands all summer, but she had always been watching them work. Now they were still, and she noticed the things she had not noticed before: the scars from old cuts, the stains from years of oil, the way the skin over his knuckles had grown loose and thin. They were hands that had opened thousands of watches, had held thousands of broken things, and put them back together one by one. They were, she thought, some of the most useful hands she had ever seen. She thought about the soldier's watch and the woman who had carried it so carefully. She thought about the small wristwatch she had repaired, and about the older woman who was going to come into the shop one day and take it home and put it on her wrist. She thought that how that woman did not know her name and would never know she had been the one to fix it. She found she did not mind. She asked her grandfather if she could come back in the winter, during the school holiday. He looked at her for a moment with an expression she could not quite read, surprise, perhaps, or something quieter than surprise. He said yes. On the train back to the city, Nadia put her earphones in but did not play any music. She watched the fields pass outside the window and thought about patience. She had always believed that doing things quickly was the same as doing things well. She had believed that speed was a form of intelligence. She had believed that the world rewarded people who moved fast and thought fast and decided fast. She still thought there was truth in that, but she also understood now that there were some things that could not be rushed, some work that only worked if you slowed down, if you paid full attention, if you let the process take the time it needed and did not fight it. The watch she had repaired had not cared how fast her hands could move. It had cared only about whether her hands were careful. And careful was something she was still learning, but she had started, and that was the part that mattered. She thought about the ticking of her grandfather's shop, all those clocks, all that sound, measuring every second carefully and exactly, never in a hurry, never late. She looked at her own wrist. She was not wearing a watch, but she thought that soon she might be.